Trail. Elena had always been an avid hiker, but this trip was different. She had taken a leave of absence from her job as a librarian, seeking solace in the wild, far away from the city's relentless hum. The trail she chose, known as Whispering Pines, was notorious for its eerie stories, but she dismissed them as mere campfire tales. The trailhead was hidden behind a dense thicket, almost as if it was trying to conceal its presence. Elena pushed through the foliage and saw the weathered sign, Whispering Pines Trail. She took a deep breath, filled her pack with essentials, and started down the path. The forest was unusually silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. Elena was used to nature's noises, but this quiet was unsettling. She shrugged it off and continued, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena set up camp near a small clearing. The campsite was surrounded by thick trees, their twisted branches casting long shadows. She lit a small fire and cooked a modest meal, the crackling flames the only source of light and warmth. Night fell quickly, and the darkness seemed to seep into every corner of the forest. Elena sat by the fire, reading a book to pass the time. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees in a way that seemed almost intentional. It felt like someone was trying to speak to her, but the words were indistinct and lost in the rustling leaves. As the night deepened, Elena heard something that made her freeze, a faint, rhythmic thudding. It was like footsteps, but not quite. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the trees and fading away before she could pinpoint their source. She glanced around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The firelight flickered and danced, casting eerie shadows that played tricks on her eyes. Deciding she must be imagining things, Elena forced herself to relax and crawled into her tent. She had barely fallen asleep when a sound jolted her awake. The rhythmic thudding was back, louder this time, and accompanied by a low, mournful moan. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she tried to determine where the noise was coming from. It was too dark to see anything outside the tent, but she felt a growing sense of dread. Summoning her courage, Elena unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had burned low, casting a dim, flickering glow over the clearing. The thudding was still there, but now it seemed to be moving closer. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and that's when she saw them. 3 shadowy figures, their outlines shifting and blurring as they moved. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. The figures were tall and seemed to glide rather than walk. She could see no faces, just dark shapes against the trees. Panic surged through her, but she knew she had to stay calm. She grabbed her flashlight and shone it in their direction, but the beam only illuminated empty space where the figures had been. The thudding stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Elena's hands trembled as she unzipped the tent and stepped outside, flashlight in hand. She moved cautiously toward the fire pit, scanning the area for any sign of the figures. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a voice whispered in her ear, so close it was almost a breath. "Help us." Elena spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to echo from within the trees, its source indiscernible. Her instincts told her to leave, but her curiosity kept her rooted. She noticed something glinting in the firelight, a small tarnished locket lying in the dirt. She picked it up, noticing its intricate design. The locket was cold and heavy in her hand. With a shaking hand, she opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young couple. A sharp pain pierced her chest as she stared at the photograph. The couple in the picture looked eerily familiar. Elena couldn't place them, but their faces seemed to hold a sorrowful gaze, as if pleading for something. The thudding returned, now accompanied by a faint, mournful song. The figures reappeared, closer this time, their forms more defined. Elena realized with horror that they were not just shadows, but spectral figures, their features twisted in anguish. She stumbled backward, the locket slipping from her fingers and falling into the dirt. One of the figures, a man with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression, stepped closer. His hand reached out toward her, and Elena felt an icy chill. The other figures, a woman and a child, joined him, their eyes filled with an indescribable sadness. Suddenly, the figures stopped moving and their faces turned to the locket lying on the ground. Elena's eyes followed their gaze, and she realized with a start that the locket had a name engraved on it. Elena. She gasped, her mind racing. How could her name be on this locket? The spectral figures seemed to notice her realization, their expressions shifting to one of resignation. The man's ghostly lips parted in a silent plea, and the figures began to fade, merging back into the darkness. Elena's heart raced as she scrambled to pick up her belongings and pack her tent. The forest around her seemed to close in, the once familiar path now an intimidating maze of shadows. She fled through the darkness, guided only by the faint light of her flashlight and the fading echoes of the mournful song. As she reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Elena stumbled out of the forest, her clothes torn and her mind reeling. She looked back at the Whispering Pines trail, its eerie silence now a distant memory. In the safety of her car, Elena took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. As she drove away, she glanced at the photograph she had taken of the locket. Her hands trembled as she noticed the inscription on the back, "To Elena, our last hope." The forest had claimed many before her, and as she drove away, Elena realized with a shiver that the locket's message was clear. She had been the latest in a long line of souls drawn to Whispering Pines, a trail with a dark and tragic history. The echoes of Widow's Peak. Samantha was an experienced hiker, always drawn to the solitude of nature. When she heard about the Widow's Peak Trail, a hidden path in the Appalachian Mountains reputed to have a dark history, she was intrigued. The trail was said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman who had vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. The morning Samantha set out, the weather was clear and crisp, the air invigorating. She parked her car at the trailhead, which was marked by a weathered sign nearly obscured by overgrown ivy, Widow's Peak Trail. With her backpack packed and her spirit high, she began her hike. The forest quickly enveloped her in a dense canopy, the light filtering through in mottled patches. The trail was narrow and winding, with steep inclines and rocky outcrops. As she climbed higher, the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by a profound, unsettling silence. The air grew colder, and a mist began to roll in, adding an eerie quality to the landscape. Around midday, Samantha reached a small clearing. There, in the middle, was an old abandoned cabin. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Samantha hesitated but decided to investigate. She was curious about the history of the place, despite the warning signs from the locals. Inside, the cabin was dusty and decrepit, with cobwebs draping from the ceiling and a musty odor permeating the air. Samantha explored the main room, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. She found old furniture covered in a thick layer of dust, and on the wall, a faded photograph of a woman in old-fashioned clothing. As she examined the photo, she noticed that the woman's eyes seemed almost alive, following her movements with an unsettling intensity. Samantha felt a shiver run down her spine, but shook it off. She left the cabin and continued her hike, the air growing even colder as she ascended. The trail became steeper and more treacherous. The fog thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Samantha's footsteps echoed strangely in the mist, and she began to feel like she was being watched. Every so often, she thought she heard faint whispers carried on the wind, but when she stopped to listen, the forest was silent. As the afternoon waned, Samantha reached a high vantage point. The view was breathtaking, with the forest stretching out below like a green sea. She took a moment to rest and take in the scenery. It was then that she noticed something strange in the distance, an old, crumbling stone structure, partially hidden by trees. Driven by curiosity, she made her way toward the structure. As she approached, the whispers grew louder, forming coherent phrases she couldn't quite make out. The structure turned out to be an old watchtower, its stone walls covered in creeping ivy. Inside, the air was musty and cold. Samantha climbed the narrow staircase, her flashlight flickering as she ascended. At the top, she found a small room with a single window, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. On a wooden table in the center of the room lay an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. She opened the journal and began to read. The entries were written in a hurried, frantic script. They spoke of a woman who had been searching for something in the forest, a loved one, a hidden treasure, or perhaps an escape from something. The entries grew more desperate and disjointed, ending abruptly with a final, chilling note. "They're coming for me." A sudden gust of wind blew through the watchtower, and Samantha's flashlight flickered wildly. The temperature dropped sharply, and she felt a presence behind her. Turning slowly, she saw a figure materializing from the mist, an ethereal woman in tattered clothing, her eyes hollow and sad. Samantha's heart raced. The ghostly woman's gaze was filled with a haunting sorrow. She raised a trembling hand, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, their cries blending into a single mournful wail. The woman reached out, her hand almost touching Samantha's. In a moment of clarity, Samantha understood that the woman's spirit was trapped, and the whispers were the echoes of those who had been lost or seeking something within the forest. The journal, the cabin, and the whispers were all part of a tragic story. Determined to help, Samantha recalled the journal's final entry. She remembered that the woman had been searching for something, perhaps a way to break free from the forest's grip. Samantha needed to find the answer before the presence of the forest overcame her. She grabbed the journal and rushed back to the cabin. With the ghostly whispers growing louder, she frantically searched for anything that might provide a clue. The answer came to her as she noticed a loose floorboard in the corner of the cabin. Beneath it, she found an old, rusty key. Samantha realized that the key might be for something important, perhaps a way to help the trapped spirit. She returned to the watchtower where the ghostly woman was waiting, her form flickering in and out of existence. With a deep breath, Samantha held the key up. The woman's eyes seemed to follow it with an intense focus. The air grew lighter, and the whispers began to calm. The ghostly figure reached out and touched the key, her form glowing with a soft light. The ghost's expression softened, and a sense of peace washed over her. She looked at Samantha with gratitude before slowly fading away, the mist lifting and the temperature returning to normal. As the sun began to set, Samantha made her way back down the trail, feeling a profound sense of relief. The forest no longer felt oppressive, and the whispers had ceased. She knew she had helped release a trapped soul, and the experience would remain with her forever. When she finally reached her car, she looked back at the Widow's Peak Trail, now bathed in the golden light of dusk. The forest had shown its darker side, but it had also revealed a story of sorrow and redemption. Samantha felt a deep respect for the wilderness and its hidden secrets, knowing that sometimes the echoes of the past needed to be heard and understood. The lantern's light. James had always loved exploring remote places, especially those with a touch of mystery. So when he heard about the Lantern's Light Trail, a secluded path in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest rumored to be haunted, he was both intrigued and eager for the adventure. Local legend spoke of a lost lantern that could guide or mislead depending on its whims. On a crisp autumn morning, James set out to tackle the trail. The sky was overcast and a light drizzle fell, adding a misty veil to the forest. He parked his car at the trailhead, marked by a simple worn sign that read, "Lantern's Light Trail." The path seemed inviting despite the ominous tales. As James hiked, the dense forest closed in around him, the trees draped in moss and the ground slick with fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. The trail was well trodden at first, but it soon became narrow and winding. The light drizzle had turned into a steady rain, adding a rhythmic patter to the forest's silence. Around noon, James stumbled upon an old, weather-beaten cabin. It looked abandoned, but curiosity got the better of him. He pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The cabin's interior was dusty, with cobwebs hanging from the rafters and old, rotting furniture scattered about. On a wooden table in the corner, James noticed an old lantern. Its metal was tarnished, and its glass was fogged with age. He picked it up and examined it, noting its intricate design and the faded engraving on the base. Light the way. Intrigued, James decided to light the lantern. He rummaged through his pack for matches and struck one, carefully igniting the wick. The lantern cast a warm, flickering light that seemed oddly comforting in the gloomy cabin. James placed it on the table and took a moment to explore the rest of the cabin. In the dim light of the lantern, he found a stack of old journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. One journal in particular caught his eye. It was bound in cracked leather and had a lock. Curiosity piqued. James took the journal with him and left the cabin, lantern in hand. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast. The trail was now nearly invisible under a thick layer of fallen leaves. The lantern's light provided a steady, reassuring glow as James continued his hike. After a few hours, he came across a fork in the trail. He consulted his map, but the lantern's light seemed to cast strange shadows that made it difficult to determine the correct path. Hesitant, he decided to follow the left path, which appeared less traveled. The trail became increasingly overgrown and twisted, and James felt an odd sense of déjà vu. The lantern's light flickered ominously, casting eerie shapes on the trees and rocks. As he pressed on, the forest grew darker and the path more confusing. Suddenly, the lantern's light flared brightly, illuminating a hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small, decrepit stone altar. James approached cautiously, feeling a strange pull toward it. The altar was covered in moss and grime, but the faint outline of symbols was visible. He set the lantern on the altar and opened the journal he had found. The lock was rusted, and with a little effort, James pried it open. The journal's pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. They described a man's desperate search for a lost treasure and his quest to light the way with an enchanted lantern. The last entry was written in a shaky hand. The lantern is both guide and trickster. Follow its light with care. The truth lies where shadows fall. As James read the entry, the lantern's light began to dim and flicker erratically. The air grew colder, and the shadows around the clearing seemed to stretch and warp. He glanced around, feeling a rising sense of dread. A figure emerged from the darkness, a ghostly apparition of a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing. The figure's eyes were hollow, and its face was a mask of sorrow and desperation. It pointed to the altar, and then to the lantern. James's heart raced as he realized that the figure was the journal's author, trapped between worlds. The ghostly man's expression shifted to one of pleading. He seemed to be trying to communicate something, but his voice was lost in the howling wind. Desperate to understand, James moved closer to the altar, where the lantern's light grew fainter. He noticed that the symbols on the altar formed a pattern, one that matched the diagrams in the journal. He traced the symbols with his fingers, trying to decipher their meaning. The lantern's light flickered violently, casting erratic shadows. James saw the ghostly figure's anguish grow as the light dimmed. He remembered the journal's warning about shadows and followed the pattern of symbols, aligning the lantern's light with specific marks on the altar. As the lantern's light fell in the right places, the shadows began to shift and reveal hidden markings. One of the markings formed an arrow pointing to a concealed compartment in the altar. James pried it open and found a small, ornate box inside. His hands trembled as he opened the box, revealing an ancient, intricately designed amulet. The moment James held the amulet up to the lantern's light, the ghostly figure let out a cry of relief. The spirit's form began to fade, its face softening into a peaceful expression. The lantern's light grew steady and bright, casting away the oppressive shadows. The ghostly figure vanished, leaving behind a sense of calm. The amulet glowed softly in James's hand, and he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He knew he had freed the spirit from its torment. With the amulet safely tucked away, James made his way back to the trailhead. The forest seemed less intimidating, and the path back was clear and straightforward. The lantern's light guided him safely, its glow now steady and warm. As he reached his car, James looked back at the lantern's light trail, the overcast sky beginning to clear. The experience had been both terrifying and enlightening, revealing the delicate balance between guidance and deception. James knew he would always remember the trail and the lantern that had illuminated his path through the darkness. The Forgotten Trail. Emily had always been fascinated by urban legends, particularly those involving haunted places, so when she came across an old map in a dusty antique shop marked with a trail called the Forgotten Trail deep in the Maine woods, she was immediately intrigued. The map hinted at a once popular path that had mysteriously vanished from modern maps. According to local lore, the trail was haunted by the restless spirits of those who had gone missing there. Equipped with her gear and the map, Emily set out for a weekend adventure. The map was old, with faded ink and tattered edges, but the trailhead was still marked by a large, gnarled oak tree, easily identifiable from the sketch. She parked her car and made her way through the dense forest, following the map's directions. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the sound of her footsteps breaking the silence. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural canopy. The deeper Emily ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around her, the light dimming as if the trees were swallowing it up. After a few hours of hiking, Emily arrived at a small clearing where she found the remnants of an old cabin. The structure was dilapidated, its walls crumbling and roof caved in. Curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to investigate. Inside, the cabin was filled with dust and decay, but Emily noticed an old journal lying on a rotting table. She picked it up and began flipping through the pages. The journal's entries were dated from the early 1900s and belonged to a man named Henry Caldwell. The entries described his fascination with the forest and his search for a hidden treasure rumored to be buried somewhere along the forgotten trail. The last entry was abruptly cut off. "I can hear them now. The voices, they are calling to me." Emily's curiosity grew. She continued down the trail, now more alert and slightly unnerved by the journal's mention of voices. The path became increasingly overgrown, the way forward obscured by tangled vines and roots. The atmosphere grew heavier, and Emily could feel a chill in the air. As dusk began to fall, the forest seemed to change. The once familiar sounds of the woods, birds, rustling leaves, were replaced by an eerie silence. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over everything. Emily checked her map, which showed the trail leading to a large rock formation marked as the Sentinel. She pressed on, guided by the map and the faint outline of the rock formation in the distance. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The area around the rock was unnaturally quiet, and the shadows seemed to move and stretch in odd ways. At the base of the Sentinel, Emily found a stone slab with strange markings carved into it. The markings resembled symbols from the journal, and she felt a sudden unease. She reached into her backpack and took out a flashlight, shining it on the symbols. The light revealed a hidden compartment in the stone slab. Inside the compartment was a small wooden box, worn and weathered. Emily's hands shook slightly as she opened it. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, its surface engraved with intricate designs. The locket felt cold in her hand, and she noticed a faded photograph inside, a picture of a woman with a solemn expression. As she studied the locket, the silence around her deepened, and the air grew colder. Emily felt a presence, as if someone or something was watching her. The feeling was almost palpable, and she heard a faint whisper like a breeze carrying distant voices. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent phrases. "Return it, return the locket, or join us." Panic surged through Emily. She looked around, but the forest was dark and empty. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, growing more insistent. She decided to retrace her steps and return to the cabin, hoping to find answers. The forest path back to the cabin seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, as if the forest itself was shifting to trap her. Emily's flashlight flickered, and the whispers grew louder, filling her ears with an unending stream of voices. When she finally reached the cabin, the door was ajar, and she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The journal was still on the table, and Emily took another look at the entries. The final, unfinished note mentioned the locket and its power to control the spirits trapped in the forest. Realizing that the locket was the key to breaking the curse, Emily knew she had to return it to where it belonged. She followed the map back to the Sentinel, the whispers growing more frantic with every step. The shadows seemed to reach out, and the cold grew more intense. At the Sentinel, Emily placed the locket back in the stone slab's hidden compartment. The moment she did, the whispers stopped and the oppressive feeling lifted. The air warmed and the shadows receded. The forest around her seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As Emily made her way back to her car, the trail seemed less menacing. The forest, once dark and foreboding, now felt tranquil and welcoming. She reached her car just as dawn began to break, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the trees. Emily left the forgotten trail with a profound sense of accomplishment and respect for the mysteries of the forest. The locket's return had freed the trapped spirits, and the trail's secrets were now part of her own adventure. She knew she would always remember the eerie voices and the chilling presence of the forgotten trail, a place where the past and present converged in an unforgettable experience.